The slave auction had been grinding for hours when farmer Caleb Eldridge raised his hand, spending his life savings to buy a caged orc she-warrior. He wasn't there to own her. He was there to free her. But the instant his bid won, the orc's eyes locked on him with fury. Because her chains weren't a trap, they were her ticket into the estate of the man who held her sister captive. And this well-meaning farmer just destroyed the only rescue plan she had. Caleb didn't know that the orc he'd purchased was Druska Ironclaw, a war-scarred gladiator who had never been taken alive in 23 kills. She was in that cage by design. The slaver Rathbone Hask had seized her 10-year-old sister months ago and kept her as a trophy in his estate. Druska's plan was to be sold directly to Hask, get inside his walls, and slaughter every trafficker standing between her and that child. Instead, she was now the property of a kindly farmer who had no clue he'd just sabotaged a one-woman war. And with Hask's caravan leaving the auction grounds at dawn, the clock was already ticking. If they didn't move fast, the sister would vanish into a network that stretched across 3 kingdoms. The iron cage creaked as the auctioneer counted the money into Caleb's trembling palm. He didn't want the change. He rushed to the bars, key already out, a farmer's earnest smile breaking through the dust. Druska watched him approach and felt something colder than the chains. He thought he was saving her. She knew he had just locked the last door between her and Kethra. As the lock clicked free, she surged forward. Not at him, but past him, her shackled hands grabbing the bars of the cage door. "No," she said in broken trade common, the words scraping through her tusks like a blade over stone. "You don't open. You don't." Caleb stumbled back. "I'm freeing you. You are killing her." The words hung in the night air, thick with the smoke of a dozen merchant fires. Around them, the remnants of the auction crowd scattered. No one wanted to be near an uncontrolled orc. But Druska wasn't uncontrolled. Her fury had a target, and for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't the human standing in front of her. She forced herself to breathe, to find the words this man would understand. She had been a gladiator of the Ironclaw Hills. She had addressed crowds of screaming thousands. But now she was a mother with a child in the next valley over, and every heartbeat since the auction gavel dropped had been one heartbeat closer to that child being lost forever. "Slaver," Druska said. "Hask. I needed him to buy me, not you." She held up her manacles. "This was my door into his estate. My sister is in there. You slammed that door shut." Caleb's face went pale. He had been a good man his whole life, the kind of good that believed one person's kindness could fix a broken world. He had sold 3 harvests of wheat to afford this single rescue, a penance for a wife he hadn't been able to save from the same slavers who now trafficked orc children across the border. He had watched them take her while he lay bleeding in a ditch, and for 16 years he had dreamed of a single moment when he could balance that ledger. He had chosen Druska because she fought her captors until she was a blur of iron and rage. He'd thought, that one wants freedom the most. He never considered she might be chained for a reason other than coercion. She told him the rest in the fetid quiet of the livestock pens. Her 10-year-old sister Kethra was the small, quiet shadow of their clan. When the raiders came 6 months ago, Druska had been away at a garrison contract. She returned to Ashes, and the only slaver stupid enough to keep a trophy instead of selling her for quick coin was Rathbone Hask, a man who collected rare children like other men collected gemstones. He ran a network of private buyers, wealthy lords, and guild masters who wanted exotic servants. Kethra, with her translucent tusks and marble-green eyes, was a premium acquisition. Hask had been parading her through his estate like a pedigreed animal, while Druska, the sister who'd promised their dying mother she would always protect the girl, tore the countryside apart, searching. Then she discovered Hask attended the Thornville slave auctions personally. He was looking for gladiator stock to guard his compound, so she stopped running from capture. She put herself in the path of a rival trader, let them take her without a fight, and ensured word of Druska Ironclaw, the unbeaten pit champion, reached the auction block before she did. Hask would bid on her. He'd want her for his arena collection. Once inside his estate, she would turn his own guards into cordwood, find Kethra, and burn his fortress to the ground. It was a brutal plan. It had one flaw. It required no one else to bid higher. Caleb had bid higher. He stood in the dust, the key still in his hand, and for the first time in decades, his righteousness felt like a weapon he'd pointed the wrong way. "I have a horse," he said. "I have supplies. I can take you to his compound." Druska gave a hollow laugh. "The caravan leaves at dawn. 15 armed men. Hask will be in a fortified wagon with a rotating guard. By the time your plow horse gets us to the gate, Kethra will be in a shipping crate headed for the Cragspire port." The word Cragspire landed like a death knell. That port was the eastern hub of the continent's trafficking network, an ungoverned maze where a child could disappear into 1,000 different ships in a single tide. Once she was there, not even Druska's entire clan could find her. But then the orc squared her shoulders and looked at the farmer with a different kind of calculation. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a spy. But he was invisible. The one thing she could never be. No one at Hask's camp would look twice at a humble homesteader traveling with his purchased labor. If she stayed in chains, if they played the roles of master and servant, he could walk her right through the camp gate. It was a terrible idea, built on a foundation of mutual distrust and the slim chance that this soft-hearted human could keep his nerve under pressure. It was also the only idea they had left. Caleb didn't hesitate. He had already lost one innocent to inaction. He would not lose another. "I can get us inside," he said. "I'll claim I'm a buyer from the northern plains looking for child labor for a farming operation. Hask won't question fresh coin." Druska narrowed her eyes. "And if he asks to see your coin?" Caleb pulled a leather purse from his belt, the same savings he'd emptied to buy her. He hadn't spent all of it. Enough left to look like a serious offer for a young girl. It was a thin disguise, but a hungry slaver's greed was a known weakness. Within minutes, they were riding double on his old farm horse, a quiet beast too broken to spook at an orc's scent. Druska's chains were cinched in a way that looked secure, but could be slipped in 10 seconds. They pushed through the night, following the wheel ruts of Hask's advanced supply wagons. The auctioneer had told Caleb that the main camp was 3 hours east, nestled in Dead Horse Hollow. They reached the ridge above the hollow just as the sky began to threaten dawn. Below, a dozen covered wagons formed a defensive square. Prisoners huddled in a central pen, and near the back of the camp, a solitary cart with iron-shuttered windows sat under 4 torches. That was the trophy cart. Kethra would be there. But as they watched, the camp stirred faster than it should have. Men shouted orders. The trophy cart's horses were being hitched prematurely. A rider galloped in from the north, cutting through the chaos with a satchel of dispatches. Seconds later, the cart lurched forward, heading for the eastern trail under heavy escort, a full 2 hours earlier than scheduled. Something had spooked Hask. Perhaps word had reached him that his intended gladiator purchase was now in the hands of a stranger, and a man of his paranoia didn't leave rare merchandise vulnerable. Whatever the reason, the sister was moving now. Druska lunged without thinking. Only Caleb's farm-hardened arm, hooked under her chains, stopped her from charging the 4 armed outriders now flanking the cart. "They'll kill her if we hit the escort out here," he hissed. "We need to catch them at the river crossing, where the ground is soft and the guards are stuck in mud. There's a shortcut through the gorge." It was sound logic, the kind a man who knew the terrain better than any caravan master could deploy. They turned the horse into the tree line and raced the dawn. They were 100 yards from the river bend when a torch flared on the ridge behind them. A high, thin whistle cut the morning. Not a bird. A scout signal. Hask's perimeter had spotted them. The cart on the road below didn't stop, but the outriders wheeled 2 horses back, drawing blades, and charged up the slope directly at a farmer and an orc who were now out of time, out of cover, and out of friends. Druska ripped her chains free with a snap that echoed off the gorge walls. The fight was coming to them, and the cart was still moving. The first rider came over the slope with a cavalry saber raised high, a man who'd cut down unarmed prisoners his whole career and expected another easy kill. He was wrong. Druska didn't dodge. She stepped into the horse's path, her manacled chain still looped around her left fist, and swung the heavy iron shackle like a morning star into the beast's foreleg. The horse screamed and pitched. The rider flew forward, caught his own blade in the mud, and before he could rise, Druska's knee was on his throat. The sound of his windpipe collapsing was not a sound a man hears twice. The second outrider was smarter. He circled wide, using the slope to hide his approach, and aimed a crossbow bolt at the orc's spine. He never fired. A length of braided leather slapped around the weapon's stock and yanked it skyward. The bolt went into the dawn clouds. The sling had come from Caleb's hand. Not a farmer's tool for scaring crows, but a shepherd's weighted cord with a stone that cracked the rider's wrist on the follow-through. The man dropped the bow and reached for his knife, but Caleb was already on him, moving with the low, compact economy of someone who'd learned to fight in spaces where a stumble meant death. The knife was gone. The rider was on the ground, unconscious before the farmer's breathing had changed. Druska rose from the dead man and watched Caleb retrieve his sling. "Farmers don't throw like that," she said. "Farmers don't know how to take a crossbow without breaking the string." Caleb didn't look at her. "I grew up on the border. You learn things." It wasn't an answer. She filed it. The cart was still moving. They had no time to interrogate each other. They remounted and pushed down the deer track toward the river bend. The shortcut through the gorge was treacherous, loose shale, and walls so narrow the horse had to flatten its ears. But it cut the distance in half. When they burst from the tree line onto the riverbank, the cart was there. The 4 escort horses were unhitched, grazing. 2 guards sat by a fire. The rear of the cart's iron door hung open. The cart was empty. Druska's entire body went rigid. The guards didn't notice them yet, but the orc's eyes were fixed on the open door and the small wooden figure lying in the mud beside it. A horse, carved from ash wood. Kethra's. The girl had been whittling it the morning the raiders came, a gift for her sister's name day. Druska had watched her drop it in the dirt when the slavers grabbed her. That toy was never supposed to leave the clanhold. That it was here, placed deliberately on the riverbank like a calling card, meant one thing. Hask had already known she was coming. She started forward, but Caleb grabbed her arm. "Wait, it's staged." He nodded toward the fire. The guards were young, untested, the kind of men who'd be posted to a decoy. The real security was already moving, He pointed to a fresh set of wheel tracks heading north, away from the river, deep and heavy with a load. They transferred her to a stronger escort. That cart was a Dodge. They knew we'd follow this route. How? Druska's voice was a blade drawn from a scabbard. How does Hask know my sister's toy? How does he know I'm coming? Caleb's silence was the wrong kind. The silence of a man who'd been keeping something closer than a weapon. Behind them, one of the guards stood, finally catching their shapes against the river mist. "Riders!" he shouted. The second guard scrambled for a signal horn. If that horn blew, the entire network of scouts between here and Hask's estate would converge. They had seconds. Druska moved to intercept, but Caleb was faster. Not farmer fast, soldier fast. His sling thrummed twice. The first stone shattered the horn before lips touched it. The second dropped the guard into the fire with a scream that cut off when his partner clubbed him silent in a panic to avoid attention. The panic didn't help. Druska had the partner by the throat in 4 strides. "Where is the girl?" she demanded. The man's face was purple before she loosened her grip enough for words. Hask took her. Sunrise. Said he had a buyer who'd pay extra for a private viewing. They went to the estate. He pointed north, toward the smoke of the main camp. But you'll never get in. He's doubled the perimeter. Everyone knows about the orc who escaped the auction. He's expecting you. This was the moment the plan truly died. Not the plan to free Kethra, but the hope that they could do it with stealth. Hask had anticipated everything, even the decoy cart, even the shortcut. Druska released the guard and let him crumple. She looked at the carved horse in the mud. She picked it up, cradling it in her palm. Emotions were a luxury she'd trained out of herself in the pits. But the small wooden horse, the smell of ash, the tooth marks where Kethra had chewed the ear while thinking, these undid 23 kills of discipline. Her eyes burned. She tucked the toy into her belt. "You know," she said to Caleb, not a question. "You knew Hask would expect me. You knew the auction was a trap. You said you had a way into the estate. That was never about my sister. You were already heading there." The farmer didn't deny it. He knelt, washed his sling in the river, and finally looked at her. "Hask took my wife 16 years ago. Her name was Lyra. She wasn't just a farmer's wife. She was a cartographer for the border militia, a woman who'd mapped every smuggling route across the Thornville Ridges. Hask didn't snatch her randomly. He targeted her. He needed her maps. She died in his estate before I could get to her. I watched them carry her body out under a tarpaulin. I was in a ditch with a broken leg, 3 of his outriders standing on my back. I've been preparing to walk through that gate ever since." The confession rearranged everything. Caleb wasn't a naive good man seeking redemption. He was a widowed operative, a patient hunter who'd spent 16 years curating the identity of a simple farmhand while collecting intelligence on Hask's operation. The auction wasn't a random act of mercy. He had been waiting for a gladiator strong enough to hold Hask's attention, someone the slaver would want to possess. Druska Ironclaw, the unbeaten pit champion, was exactly the bait he needed. The bid wasn't a mistake. It was the move he'd been setting up for months. He just didn't factor in the sister. That detail had blindsided him as much as her. "You used me," Druska said. "Yes, the same way you used the farmer's kindness to get into Hask's camp. We're both liars. The question is whether we stay in this together or tear each other apart before Kethra is sold to a private buyer tonight." The word "tonight" seized her attention. "How do you know it's tonight?" Caleb pulled a folded parchment from his tunic. It was a copy of Hask's event ledger, the same one he'd been studying for years. He holds private auctions for his premium stock every full moon. Tonight is the full moon. He'll parade Kethra in front of a room of collectors, then sell her to the highest bid. If she leaves that estate, she'll vanish into a fortified manor where no militia can touch her. We have until midnight. Druska looked at the man with new eyes. The same green eyes she'd dismissed as soft were now the flat, calculating windows of someone who'd been living a double life longer than she'd been killing. She thought about her own file on him, the one she'd been building since the auction, the way he'd built a smokeless fire in the hollow, the way he'd ridden a broken farm horse without ever losing his seat during a gallop, the sling, the silence, the fact that he'd known the gorge shortcut. It all clicked into place. He wasn't just a farmer with secrets. He was a man who'd been deconstructing Hask's network from the outside for 16 years, and he was offering her the key. The estate has a service entrance on the south wall, Caleb said. Lyra mapped it before she died. She called it the root cellar door because it opens into the old storage tunnels under the pantry. I've never been inside, but I've memorized the floor plan from her notes. If we can get through the tunnels, we can reach the auction gallery before the bidding starts. The problem is the outer patrols. After your escape, they'll be on high alert. They'll stop anything moving near the wall, but they won't stop a buyer with a subdued gladiator in chains. They'll want the coin. He proposed a new lie. They would walk into the estate as a northern trader and his prized orc fighter, a last-minute arrival for the private auction. Caleb's remaining coin was enough to flash as earnest money. The guards would see a nervous human with a dangerous beast on a leash. They wouldn't see two people who'd already killed 3 of Hask's men that morning. The risk was enormous. If Hask recognized Druska from the auction description, or if anyone had seen Caleb's face, they'd be dead before they cleared the gate. But the alternative was waiting until the auction was over and hoping the guard rotations thinned. Hope had never saved a child. Druska snapped the chain from her wrist with a decisive pull. If we do this, there are rules. First, I am not a prisoner. If I need to move, I move. Second, if I tell you to run with Kethra, you run. Don't look back. Don't be brave. Get her out. Caleb nodded. Third, she said, stepping close enough that her tusks were inches from his face. When this is over, if we survive, I want everything. Every detail you've been hiding from me. The maps, the contacts, the real reason you've been chasing Hask for 16 years. Because a dead wife's maps don't drive a man to learn sling combat against crossbowmen. There's more. Caleb's jaw tightened. There's more, he admitted, but offered nothing further. The pivot was in that admission. The farmer wasn't just a widowed cartographer's husband. He had a deeper score to settle, something he wasn't ready to reveal, and it would surface when they least expected it. They moved north along the river until the estate's walls rose against the midday sky. It was a hulking structure of reclaimed fortress stone, built from the bones of a fallen keep and expanded with timber slave barracks and a gaudy manor house. Torches lined the perimeter. Guard towers bristled with crossbows. The main gate was a killing funnel. But to the south, hidden behind a thicket of elderberry, they found the root cellar door exactly where Lyra's map had marked it. It was rusted, partially overgrown, and utterly unguarded. Either Hask didn't know it existed, or he'd forgotten about the tunnels beneath his own estate. Caleb knelt and examined the lock. It was ancient, but the mechanism was still functional. He pulled 2 thin iron picks from his boot. The skill was not a farmer's. It was the patient, delicate work of a man who'd studied locks the way a devout studies scripture. The door swung open on greased hinges. Someone had maintained it recently. The tunnel beyond was dark and smelled of old root vegetables and damp earth. Druska went first because she could see in the dark. She took one of the dead outrider's short blades from her belt and vanished into the black. The passage wound under the outer wall, past collapsed storage rooms, and finally opened into the subfloor of the estate's main pantry. They could hear servants moving above, the clatter of kitchen preparations for the evening's event. The full moon auction was being catered. A butler's voice called for more wine. Druska pressed her ear to the ceiling and pinpointed a trap door behind a shelf of pickled onions. They waited until the footsteps faded, then crawled into the storage room. The house was alive with activity, but the pantry was deserted. From there, they could access the servant corridors that fed the gallery. A clock in the hall struck the 4th hour. They had 8 hours until midnight. Druska rechained her wrists loosely, and Caleb put on the mask of a nervous merchant. He slicked back his hair with a bit of kitchen grease and adjusted his tunic. The transformation was unsettling. The soft farmer was gone, replaced by a man with hard eyes who looked like he'd done this before. They exchanged one last glance, a look that acknowledged everything still unsaid between them, then stepped out of the pantry and into the servant passage. At the far end of the corridor, a guard stood leaning against the wall, chewing a piece of jerky. He saw them and frowned. "You're early for the viewing. The lot isn't set yet." Caleb didn't break stride. "I'm not here for the lot. I'm here to make a private offer on the orc child. Heard she's got rare coloring. I deal in exotics." The guard squinted at Druska, who kept her head down like a broken captive. "And this? My collateral. I'll throw her into the trade if the girl's as described." The guard's eyes widened at the implication. An adult orc gladiator, undamaged, was worth 3 times any child. The greed flickered. He reached for a ledger. "Name? Eldridge, from the plains." The guard scribbled. "Go on through to the West Gallery. Haskell want to handle this personally." The door opened into a long, torchlit corridor that smelled of old perfume and new blood. Somewhere at the end of it, Kethra was waiting. And Rathbone Hask had no idea that 2 weapons were walking directly into his auction floor, coiled and counting heartbeats. The West Gallery was a long room of scarlet drapes and oiled mahogany, the kind of place where money was never counted aloud, and lives were traded like livestock. Rathbone Hask stood at the center, a man built of soft edges and hard eyes, dressed in a burgundy coat that hadn't been cleaned of its last bloodstain. He was feeding a spiced roll to a caged lark, while his guards milled around a raised display platform. The moment he saw the merchant and his orc, he smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd been waiting for something to go wrong. "Eldridge from the plains," Hask said, rolling the name. "I don't recall an Eldridge on the guest ledger." Caleb produced a heavy purse and set it on the inspection table. "I wasn't invited. I came for the rare item preview. I heard you have a juvenile orc with unusual coloring. I trade in unique stock." Hask's eyes drifted to Druska. She kept her head bowed, body slack, the picture of a beaten fighter. He walked around her, lifting her lip to inspect the tusks, pressing a thumb into the scar tissue on her forearm. "This one's a pit champion, Ironclaw stock if I don't miss my guess. You'd trade her for a child? If the child is as rare as they say. My buyers want novelty. Size sells, but novelty sells faster." Hask snapped his fingers. A side door opened, and a handler led a line of captives onto the platform. Not the main auction stock, the private preview. 6 figures in hoods and shackles. Last was the smallest, a girl who walked with the stiff posture of someone who'd been told she'd die if she cried. Kethra. Her tusks were delicate, her eyes as green as spring buds. She scanned the room with the same sharp, desperate intelligence her sister had taught her. Her gaze passed over the bowed orc in chains. For one instant, her mouth opened. Druska didn't move. She didn't flinch. But something in the air tightened, and Hask noticed. "You there," he said to Kethra. "Know that prisoner?" The girl shook her head too quickly. "No, master." Hask glanced at Druska. "Look up, beast." Druska lifted her head with the slow obedience of a creature who knew its place. Her eyes were empty. She stared at Kethra as though at a wall. Hask's grin returned. "Loyal. Good. We'll test that." He pulled a small curved knife from his belt and pressed the tip against Kethra's cheek. "Tell me why you really came, or I open her face." This was the moment the entire operation threatened to detonate. Caleb's hand moved toward his belt, but Druska spoke first, her voice flat. "I came because my master bought me, and he likes exotic children. I don't care about the whelp." The knife hovered. Hask watched her for a long, hideous second. Then he laughed. "Cold. I like that." He sheathed the blade and gestured to his guards. "We'll discuss the trade after the main auction. For now, your brute goes to the holding pen. You can collect her when we've settled the girl's price." Two guards seized Druska's chains. She didn't resist. Caleb had to let her be led away, knowing that if the holding pen was anything like the kill floor cages the original transcript described, she'd be locked with the other fighting stock, guards posted at every corner. But this was the plan, if a plan this fragile could be called one. Get inside, stay close, and wait for the chaos of the auction. He'd memorized the floor plan. Druska could slip her chains. The real problem was Hask's paranoia. By the time the butler refilled the wine, news had reached the gallery. 2 outriders dead at the river decoy, a third with a crushed throat on the ridge, and a farmer's horse with a bloodied saddle found tied near the gorge. Hask put it together in 3 heartbeats. His face didn't change. He merely picked a piece of meat from the lark's beak and said, "Find the farmer. He's here." The guards began a room-by-room search. Caleb, standing by the hors d'oeuvres with a glass of sherry he hadn't touched, felt the jaws closing. He had perhaps 10 minutes before someone recognized him from the auction block. He caught a servant's eye. "The washroom?" "Down the hall, second door left." He slipped into the servant corridor. Instead of the washroom, he followed his mental map toward the holding pens. If Hask was going to catch him, he wanted to be standing next to an unchained Druska when it happened. But when he rounded the corner into the lower level, a massive hand clamped over his mouth and yanked him into a storage closet. Druska stood in the dark, her chains already off, a guard's short sword in her fist. "The pens are a kill box," she whispered. 3 guards on the door, 2 more by the auction staging. And Hask just had my sister moved to his private suite. He's not selling her tonight. He's using her as bait. For me. Caleb's heart dropped. He knows who you are? He suspects. He'll dangle her in front of the auction crowd and wait for someone to break cover. If I charge the stage, his crossbowmen will drop me from the gallery rails. She looked at him. I can't stop the auction. I can't rescue her in front of 100 witnesses. Not without killing everyone in the room. And I can't kill 70 slavers before one of them slits her throat. This was the escalation point. It wasn't enough to get inside. Hask's network was a hydra, and he'd turned their desperation into a trap. Any move against Kethra would kill her. Any move against Hask would bring the entire guard force down on their heads. They were cornered, and the auction was starting in 40 minutes. Then "We don't move against Kethra," Druska said. Her voice had changed, losing the edge of immediate violence and gaining something heavier, colder, more strategic. "We move with her. We stay inside the network," she told him then. The plan she'd been carrying since before the auction block, the reason she'd clawed her way into a slaver's cage in the first place. It wasn't just about rescuing Kethra. It was about erasing the entire trade route. Hask's estate was only the hub. The network stretched across 3 kingdoms, with redundant supply lines, safe houses, and a string of corrupt magistrates who protected it. Rescuing one child would save one life. Dismantling the network would save thousands. But doing that required an agent on the inside, someone with enough access to document everything, to map every face and name, and to trigger a coordinated strike. "A human wife," she said, the words landing like a verdict. "That was my cover. I didn't kill the slaver who first grabbed me. I made him a deal. He'd sell me at your auction, let me reach Hask, and in return, I'd testify he'd been a cooperative informant when the magistrates came. I needed to be bought and brought here, not as a gladiator, but as a bride. A purchased bride raises fewer questions. She's kept close, given private access, trusted with the household." She locked eyes with Caleb. "But I was never going to marry the slaver. I needed a man with clean papers, a reputation no one would question. A farmer, maybe. A kind man with no history of trafficking. Someone who'd be seen as naive, harmless. The kind of man slavers would trust to bring a bride home and keep his mouth shut." Caleb's stomach churned. "You were hunting for a husband the whole time." "I was hunting for a cover. Your bid wasn't a disaster. It was the best mistake I could have made. Your farm is respected. Your name is clean. Hask would never suspect a Plains homesteader of running an intelligence operation. If I stay with you, not as a rescued slave, but as your purchased wife, we can return here, attend the private sales, get inside the buyer's circles. I can map the network from within. And once the dossier is complete, we burn it. Together." The scale of the revelation rearranged every assumption. She'd already chosen to stay. All her fury at the auction had been about the timing, not the outcome. She'd needed a farmer. She'd gotten one. And now she was asking him to abandon a quick rescue for a long war. Caleb thought of his wife's maps, the weapon he'd been building for 16 years. He'd always known one death wouldn't balance the ledger. This was the first time someone had offered him an entire reckoning. "If we do this," he said, "we need to get Kethra out tonight. She's not staying in Hask's suite while we play house." Druska's expression softened for the first time, a flicker of the sister beneath the warrior. "Agreed. We smuggle her out during the auction, but we stage it as an accident, a guard error, a locked door that wasn't locked. Hask will blame his own men. Then I return, buy my sister from him as a favor to settle the mess, and cement my place as your orc bride with deep pockets and a grudge against the incompetence that almost cost me my purchase." The clock struck the quarter hour. Above them, the gallery was filling with bidders, the murmur of merchants, and the clink of coin. They had 25 minutes to break a child out of a fortress, fake an escape, and establish a cover story that would hold up under the scrutiny of a man who tortured liars for sport. Caleb unspooled his sling. Druska tested the balance of her stolen sword. They could hear the guards calling for the final security sweep. The farmer and the orc warrior, 2 weapons who had started the day as enemies, stepped out of the closet and into the belly of the beast. Somewhere in the private suite above, Kethra was packing her carved horse into a satchel, not knowing that her sister had just decided to burn the entire world to save her. And in the auction hall, the first lot was about to be announced. The auctioneer's gavel struck the block, and the first lot was led forward. A pair of captured centaurs who'd been beaten into compliance. The crowd of buyers rustled with bids, but neither Caleb nor Druska heard a number. They were moving in opposite directions through the manor's tangled back corridors, each executing a piece of the escape that had no room for error. The plan was this. Druska would create a disruption in the guard barracks, while Caleb slipped into Hask's private suite, took Kethra, and vanished through the root cellar tunnel before the next lot was called. Then Druska would return to the gallery, take her place as the farmer's subdued gladiator, and act as shocked as anyone when the child's absence was discovered. Druska reached the lower barracks door, a thick oak slab with an iron bar across it. The 3 guards Hask had posted to watch the fighting stock were inside, playing dice. The outer corridor was empty. She didn't need to kill them. She needed them running. She pulled a lantern from its wall bracket, smashed the glass against the stone floor, and kicked the flaming oil onto a stack of hay bales meant for the arena beasts. The fire caught with a whoosh that sucked the air out of the hallway. Within seconds, the barracks door flew open, and the guards burst out, shouting for water. She was already gone, slipping into the servant stairwell and climbing toward the private wing. Caleb, meanwhile, had found the suite. It was behind a tapestry depicting a hunt scene, exactly where Lyra's floor plan had marked the master's inner chamber. The door was locked with a tumbler mechanism he'd practiced on 100 times, with a replica he'd carved from memory. His picks moved with the ease of long habit. The lock clicked. He stepped inside. Kethra was sitting on a velvet cushion, still in her auction shift, clutching the carved horse. When she saw him, she didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She looked at his face, at his farmer's hands, and said, "You're the man from the auction, the one with my sister." Her voice was a whisper, but there was no fear in it. Only a child's fierce patience, the same patience that had let Druska walk into a cage. I'm here to take you to her. We have to go quickly, and we have to be silent." Kethra stood without hesitation. She slipped her hand into his, as if they'd known each other for years. He noticed her tunic was torn at the sleeve, and there were fresh bruises on her wrist where a rope had been tied too tight. But her eyes were clear. She had been waiting for this. They moved back through the servant passages without encountering a single guard. The fire in the barracks had drawn every available man. The root cellar door was still open, the darkness below welcoming. They climbed down. Kethra didn't need to be carried. She kept up, her small feet finding the stones with the instinct of a child who'd learned to navigate strange floors at night. At the far end of the tunnel, the elderberry thicket was quiet. The moon had risen, fat and silver. Caleb pushed her through the door and into the arms of the old farm horse, which was tied exactly where they'd left it. "Stay here. Your sister will come for you. If anyone else comes, hide in the bracken and don't move." Kethra nodded once. Then she did something that almost broke him. She held up her carved horse and said, "Give this to her, so she knows I'm safe." He took the toy and tucked it inside his tunic. He climbed back through the tunnel, his heart a hammer. The auction was still in progress. The gavel fell again and again, and the lots were being sold. He reached the pantry, then the corridor, and slipped back into the gallery moments before a guard noticed his absence. The fire had been extinguished. The head of Hask's security was reporting that a lantern had broken, nothing more. Druska was already there, chains back on her wrists, standing in the corner with her head bowed. She didn't look at Caleb when he entered. She didn't need to. It took 20 minutes before anyone checked the private suite. A butler went to fetch Kethra for the preview, and his scream echoed through the house. Hask himself rose from his velvet chair and walked, not ran, to the room. The door was open. The cushion was empty. He stood in the doorway, and the buyers who had gathered behind him saw a man whose casual cruelty was now being pointed at his own staff. "You," he said to the floor guard, "explain." The guard stammered about the fire, the confusion, the door that had been locked when he checked it. Hask didn't raise his voice. He simply drew a pistol from his coat and shot the man in the chest. The crack silenced the room. "Find the child. She can't have left the estate. Search every room. If she's not found within the hour, every guard on duty tonight loses a hand." The search tore the manor apart. They didn't find her. The tunnel door was too hidden, and the fire had burned any tracks. By midnight, the auction was over, and the estate was in chaos. Druska made her move. She approached Hask while he was berating his captain, chains jangling, and said in her broken trade common, "Your guards lost my master's purchase. He wants compensation." Hask rounded on her. "Your master will get his compensation when I find the brat." Druska shook her head. "No, he doesn't want coin. He wants the girl still. When you find her, he will pay full price. But I stay with him until you deliver, as insurance that you keep looking." Hask studied her, his paranoia wrestling with his greed. Having a gladiator in his pocket as guarantee meant the farmer couldn't demand a refund. It also kept him tied to Hask's network, a potential repeat buyer. It was the kind of corrupt arrangement a slaver would find perfectly reasonable. "Fine," he said. "She stays. Tell your master if he breathes a word of this to the magistrates, he'll find his farm burned and his orc's head on a pike." Druska lowered her head in submission. Inside, she was counting the names and faces of every buyer she'd seen that night. Caleb and Druska left the estate at dawn, riding double on the plow horse. As soon as they were out of sight of the watchtowers, they circled back to the thicket. Kethra was there, curled under the bracken, asleep with a stick clutched in her fist like a dagger. Druska slid off the horse and gathered the child into her arms without a word. She didn't cry. She pressed her face into the girl's hair and breathed, once a sound that held a year of terror and hope. Kethra woke, saw her sister's face, and smiled. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I told them you'd kill them all." Druska pulled the carved horse from her belt and pressed it into the child's hand. "Not yet," she said. "First, we need to let them think they're safe." That was the beginning of a 5-month campaign that would be studied in abolitionist circles for generations. They returned to the farm, and Druska, armed with Caleb's clean reputation and a growing dossier of evidence, began attending every private sale Hask organized. She went as the farmer's purchased wife, a gladiator-turned-household servant who had proven her loyalty by her own silence. Hask, flattered by her deference and eager to keep the farmer's coin coming, granted her access to his ledgers, his guest lists, and his supply routes. He never suspected that every name she collected was being passed to a network of border militia and reformed magistrates that Caleb had been cultivating for 16 years. The dismantling happened not with a single battle, but with a series of coordinated strikes. First, the Eastern Trade Corridor collapsed when the coastal magistrates, presented with Druska's evidence, seized 3 ships full of captives and executed the captains who'd been bribing them for years. Then the northern safe houses were raided in a single night, 39 children freed, 24 traffickers arrested. Finally, they came for Hask. It was a wet morning in late autumn when a column of crown soldiers surrounded his estate. Hask tried to escape through the root cellar. He found the door already open, and standing in the tunnel with a short sword in her hand was Druska. She had been waiting for him. She didn't kill him. She wanted him to stand trial, to face the families of every child he'd sold. She broke his pistol hand and dragged him into the daylight by his collar. The crowd that had gathered to watch the arrest cheered not for the soldiers, but for the orc woman who had walked into a cage to burn a slaving empire from within. The public trial lasted 3 weeks. Hask's network was exposed down to its roots. Caleb's testimony, backed by his wife's original maps, and the intelligence Druska had gathered, convicted 17 lords and guildmasters who had been buying children for years. The abolitionist movement gained a foothold it had never had before, and within a year, 3 kingdoms passed laws that made the private sale of sentient beings a capital offense. The Thornville Accord, signed in the same auction house where Druska had been sold, became the foundation of a new legal era. But the story that mattered most happened quietly, on an evening the following summer, in the kitchen of a farmhouse that had once held a man's lonely grief. Caleb was sharpening a kitchen knife, the same single-edged blade his father had given him. Druska sat at the table with Kethra, teaching her to read trade common from a book of fables. The carved ash horse stood on the mantel, newly painted. The girl had insisted on adding a saddle. Druska looked at Caleb over the page, her eyes still carrying the watchfulness of a pit fighter, but now also something softer. "The network is gone," she said. "Hask is in a cell for life. The war is over. So I have a question for you." Caleb set the whetstone down. "Ask it." "When I first told you I needed a husband as cover, you didn't hesitate. You said yes. You didn't even know me. Why?" He thought for a moment. "Because my wife's last words when they dragged her away were, 'Find someone who'll fight.' I spent 16 years looking for that someone. I didn't think it would be an orc. I didn't think it would be someone who'd already chosen to stay before I knew why. But you were that someone." Druska's expression flickered. She pulled a folded parchment from her belt, a document she'd never shown him. It was a copy of the auction house's advance listing, dated 3 months before their meeting. It described a gladiator orc, Druska Ironclaw, with a handwritten note in the margin, "Under contract to a buyer seeking a husband cover. Will bid low to attract a specific mark." The mark's name was Caleb Eldridge. The auction house had known. A corrupt clerk had sold the information to Hask, who had planned to use Druska as a plant to infiltrate a farmer's home and eventually enslave his child. But Hask had never imagined the plant would turn. "You knew my name before I bought you," Caleb said. "I knew your farm, your wife's history, your vendetta. The slaver who first captured me was working both sides. He thought I'd betray you. He didn't know I'd been waiting for a man like you my whole life. A man with clean papers and a dirty war. You thought you bid on me by accident. I was never going to let anyone else win." She paused, and for the first time her voice carried the weight of a confession, not a report. "I chose to stay before you opened the cage." Kethra looked up from her book, bored by the adult talk. "Does this mean we're staying? I like the horse. She has soft ears." Caleb looked at Druska. Druska looked at the child, at the carved horse, at the farmhouse that had stopped being a cover weeks ago. "Yes," she said, "we're staying." And Caleb, who had spent 16 years planning to die in Hask's estate, realized he had never actually planned to live. He set the knife down, crossed the kitchen, and pulled his wife, because she was his wife now, not a contract but a choice, into an embrace that was clumsy and fierce and right. Kethra made a face. "You're squishing her." "She can handle it," Caleb said. Druska laughed, a sound that had never been heard in that house, and it was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done, because it meant she had something to lose. And for the first time, that felt like winning. Caleb Eldridge had walked into that auction believing he was making a simple purchase of redemption. He came out the other side as the linchpin of a covert war. The farm that had been his tomb became their headquarters, and the chains Druska had worn were melted down and forged into a plow blade that still turns the South Field every spring. They never remarried under any kingdom's law, because they didn't need a piece of paper to define what had been forged in the root cellar tunnels beneath Hask's estate. For 5 years, the Thornville Accord was enforced unevenly, but the network of informants they'd built kept the pressure on. Kethra grew up speaking trade common with a Plains accent and reading old maps as bedtime stories. She never became a warrior, but she became something rarer. A cartographer of safe routes, a quiet architect of refugee passages, and the only person in the county who could argue with both her sister and the farmer and win. The question that lingers, the one the historians still debate, is whether the whole operation could have worked without that original mistake. If Caleb hadn't outbid Hask, if Druska had gone directly into the estate as planned, she would have rescued her sister, but never met the man whose grief matched her own. She would have killed Hask, perhaps, but the network would have survived behind a new face. It took the collision of 2 separate missions, one seeking a quick death, the other a long reckoning, to create a third way neither had imagined. That's the uncomfortable truth at the core of every great dismantling. Victory doesn't always come from perfect planning. Sometimes it comes from a farmer who doesn't know he's not supposed to bid, and an orc who's already made a choice he hasn't learned to recognize yet. What you do with that truth is up to you. Some will see a love story, others will see a tactical manual. The children who walked out of Hask's safe houses saw neither. They saw a 6'3" orc woman who came for them when no one else did, and a quiet man with a sling who never stopped counting the names. If this story hits something in you, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that even a cage can be a door. Tell us in the comments which moment turned the knife for you, and we'll see you in the next one.